tripped on my way up, exactly what I wanted. Okay, we're gonna start with a story about two friends in a Turkish village called Sivas. Mariam and Krikor were in love. They couldn't be together because Mariam was promised to somebody else. So Mariam married the other man, they had a son. And when World War I broke out, Krikor went to stay with some family in Bulgaria. In 1915, Ottoman soldiers entered Sivas, and Mariam's father and husband were killed. Just a few days later, Mariam began, during the first wave of deportations, she began the journey to the Syrian desert with her 1-year-old son on her back. Along the way, her son died. She carried his body for 3 days and then eventually left him under a tree. When she eventually reached northern Syria, she got away, and dressing like a boy, she found a job cleaning rocks off of British polo fields. Krikor heard that all of the survivors from Sivas were in northern Syria, and he went to Aleppo as fast as he could. There, he found Mariam. They were reunited. Neither of their families had survived, but the two of them got married and went to Istanbul together. Mariam and Krikor were my great-grandparents, and I learned this story just over a year ago from my great-uncle. Up until about 6 years ago, I had absolutely no interest in my family's past. The child of Armenian immigrants from Istanbul, I was just interested in being Canadian. I wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be Armenian. But when I was 15, I was asked to write the obituary and eulogy at my grandfather's funeral. And sitting in the funeral home, trying to scribble down everything I knew about his life onto a napkin, I asked my mom and my grandma to list his accomplishments. It was only then that I found out who my grandfather truly was before he left Istanbul in 1967. So it turned out that, well, actually I knew this, for the last 3 years of his life, I had watched as my grandfather wrote a book about his travels with an Armenian-American author named William Saroyan. In 1964, Saroyan had come to Istanbul to find the foundations of his family's home in Bitlis, a city in eastern Turkey. He and my grandfather had embarked on a 16-day, 6,000-kilometer trip around the country. My grandpa wrote a series of newspaper articles about it, and then in the 3 years before he died, turned those into a book. But it turned out that there was much more than just that to the man that I simply considered my dada. My dada was the architect of the only church in Istanbul built in the authentic Armenian style, and he was the editor of an Armenian newspaper called Marmara. This is a pretty major Armenian newspaper in Turkey. I knew my grandparents had a subscription, but I had no idea it was because my great-grandfather had founded the paper in 1940. So this is pretty cool. But I started to ask myself, who was I? I really had no sense of what my family had left behind when they came to Canada in 1967. I needed to know more. I really couldn't understand why my family had abandoned their exciting lives for our mundane existence in Don Mills, Toronto. But my grandfather was gone. And 6 years later, on what can best be described as a whim following an exchange in Paris, I decided to show up in Istanbul. Now, on the plane from London to Istanbul, I have no idea what to expect, but I was very nervous. Identity in the diaspora is often forged out of a crisis point, and for Armenians, that crisis point is 1915. Now, my talk is not about the events of 1915, whatever you want to call it, whatever your interpretation of what happened, but you must understand that for Armenians, you can't be part of a diasporic community without being exposed to constant discussions about what happened on April 24th, 1915, when a couple of hundred Armenian intellectuals were arrested, deported, and killed, or to constant discussions about what happened in the year that followed, which resulted in the deaths of 1.5 million Armenians. These events, and the agonizing Armenian identity, are only complicated by the fact that Turkey refuses to acknowledge these events as genocide. So I was nervous showing up in Istanbul. Nervous about showing up in a country where I didn't know anyone, nervous about speaking the language, and nervous about being Armenian. And my first week in Turkey was rough. Only once I was outside my apartment did I realize how truly nervous I felt. I was afraid to order food, afraid to ask for directions, not because I was worried people would think I was a tourist, but because I was worried they would know I was Armenian. And this seems very silly in retrospect, but up until that point, I had never been so conscious of my Armenian identity, and I had never been uncomfortable being myself. There were even a couple of days during that first week that I didn't leave my apartment. I avoided contact with everyone. And inevitably, in every language that we speak, we have a different personality. I hadn't studied Armenian in about 10 years, so I couldn't really talk about my current interests. I couldn't be funny, and I was just kind of awkward. And worst of all, there was the unbearable weight of being related to my family. When I showed up in Istanbul, I was suddenly representing 4 generations of a relatively influential Armenian family with a traumatic history. I was no longer a 21-year-old Canadian. I suddenly had the memory of a 150-year-old Armenian woman from eastern Turkey, and when you're not expecting it, dealing with a sudden 130-year growth spurt is not easy. So a couple of days after I arrived, I showed up at the Marmara newspaper offices, and there, waiting for me, was a package from my grandmother. Inside this package, there was a handkerchief that they used to hold the cross in the Armenian church, along with a note. My broken Armenian led me to believe that this note said I was supposed to bring this handkerchief and gift it to the patriarch on behalf of my family. And the patriarch is the representative of Armenians in all secular and religious affairs. Naturally, I thought that this couldn't be right, but I asked for a translation, and that is exactly what the note said. So a couple of weeks later, I showed up at the church that my grandfather had designed with some people from the newspaper, and I presented them with this gift. The next day, this was on the cover of the newspaper. That is me, and the headline reads, Bedros Sobyan's granddaughter visits Galata Church. I was mortified. I wanted to crawl out of my skin. My family's story was no longer a distant narrative. It was suddenly real, and it was on the cover of the newspaper. I was really uncomfortable. And I didn't know if people were being nice to me because they liked me or because they felt like they owed something to my family. But thankfully, over the next couple of months, as I made friends from all over Turkey, I began to feel comfortable. And one in particular, a Kurdish guy from eastern Turkey whose family lived on land that was left to them for safekeeping by a deported Armenian in 1915, truly made me realize that Armenians had a place in Turkish history. I also quickly learned that in Istanbul, you don't know how your day is going to unfold. So one day, in true Istanbul fashion, through a random series of events, I ended up at the publishing house that published my grandfather's book. As soon as I arrived, I felt immediately at home. My biggest regret was not going sooner. I walked in. Everyone said, "We've been expecting you." Apparently, they were angry because they saw my picture on the cover of the paper, and they knew I was in town, and they were offended I hadn't come sooner. This publishing house was full of so much life, so many young, intelligent, engaged Armenians. In the 70s and 80s, there was a growing movement of Armenians who thought that the way to move forward from their traumatic past was to create cross-cultural communication and mutual understanding between them and the Turks. So in 1993, a publishing house, Aras, and a newspaper, Agos, were simultaneously founded as institutions to facilitate that understanding. Agos publishes in Turkish and Armenian. Aras takes Armenian works and translates them into Turkish, and Turkish works and translates them into Armenian. When Aras was founded, the director got together a bunch of young Armenians and gave them Armenian and Turkish lessons every Friday. And now, like I saw this when I walked in, these young Armenians are translating these books. And the current editor of Agos started off shelving books at Aras. I learned something huge in those last few days. These young, intelligent Armenians at Aras made me realize that Armenians in Turkey were moving forward, that their past and their present were coexisting. I asked myself why in the diaspora we were so far behind, why our past could not coexist with the present. So a few days before I left, the son of the editor of Marmara, who was basically like my father while I was in Turkey, sent me to Shishli Cemetery, the cemetery where my great-grandfather was buried. And as I stood there, looking at his grave, I could feel some sort of merging between my past and my present. I could feel a reconciliation between 21-year-old Canadian Amara and Amara with a 150-year-old past. It is painful for my family to talk about the past. For people of my grandparents' generation, the past is a past tainted by massacre. It means a life in a city that they can no longer call their own because they have made a conscious break from it. The Turkish military coup of 1960 was the last straw for many Armenians. For many of them, security and personal freedom became more important than living with others of their culture, more important than identity. And so my grandparents sent my mom to Canada and followed 2 years later. I'm among a group of young people whose families come from societies with a history of conflict. Our grandparents and our parents left because it was too painful to deal with the circumstances of their societies. They left in order to provide us with the opportunity to grow up safely and peacefully. But as they left, they didn't free future generations from the burden of conflict. As they left, their narrative was frozen in time and inevitably passed on unchanged from generation to generation. By acknowledging our past, by returning to places our families have fled, we effectively free this narrative And only then can we begin to move forward, no longer victimized by the past. Thank you.